So what does a pancreatic cancer cell have in common with a trillion-dollar data center floating in Earth's orbit?
On the surface, absolutely nothing.
Right, literally nothing. But as we dig into the startup roadmaps and the strategic analyses in front of us today, they are actually two halves of the exact same survival plan.
Yeah, for the entire global economy, really.
Exactly. Because today, you and I and everyone listening, we are staring down this invisible wall.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to fixate on the visible stuff, right? The frictionless software updates, the generative AI models getting smarter by the hour.
The illusion that the digital world can just expand forever.
Yes. But you cannot code your way out of thermodynamics.
Yes.
I mean, we are accelerating toward a hard limit, and it is built entirely out of energy.
The collision is definitely happening right now. The digital world's demand for computation is finally crashing into the physical realities of our planetary power grid.
Which is terrifying when you look at the numbers in these sources.
It really is. We are simultaneously trying to scale AI to, unprecedented heights, while also attempting to decarbonize the massive, energy-hungry industrial foundations of our society.
And both of those ambitions require just an incomprehensible amount of power.
Right.
Which means I think we're looking at this backwards. Before we can even dream of launching AI into orbit or like rewiring the global economy, we have to look at what's draining the grid right now.
On the ground.
Exactly. And we have two radically different blueprints for the future drawn from the stack of sources for today's deep dive.
Two very wild blueprints.
Yeah. The first aims to completely reinvent the $6 trillion chemical industry using microbiology.
Wow.
And the second is this audaciously massive plan to build a planetary-scale AI infrastructure, starting in the Himalayan mountains and extending literally into space.
It's science fiction that's actually being funded.
Totally. So the central question we're going to explore is how these two deep tech visions intersect, and what a historic 2005 business deal between Yahoo and Alibaba can actually teach us about surviving this incoming energy crunch.
It's a fascinating connection.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting on the ground.
Right. To set the baseline here, the overarching theme of the 21st century is going to be caloric and electrical power. The companies that master clean energy generation and fundamental efficiency, they will dictate the future of both physical production and digital computation.
So let's focus on that physical production side first. We're looking at a company called Solugen.
Yes, Solugen.
And they are attempting one of the most unexpected pivots from medical science to industrial manufacturing that I have ever seen. I mean, their origin story reads like the setup to a movie.
It really does.
You have two founders, Gaurav Chakrabarty, who is doing a combined MD PhD at the University of Texas, focusing specifically on cancer biology and enzymology, and Sean Hunt, a chemical engineer, finishing his PhD at MIT. So, a medical doctor studying tumors and an engineer studying industrial chemical plants.
Historically, those are two disciplines that do not speak the same language at all.
No, not even a little bit.
They operate in entirely different paradigms, Chemical engineering has spent the last century basically mastering brute force.
Right, big fires, big pressure.
Exactly. Applying extreme heat and pressure to petrochemicals. Whereas cancer biology, well, that's the study of how microscopic cellular machinery manipulates chemistry at body temperature.
Body temperature, right. And the breakthrough happens at a poker game in Dallas.
Of all places.
Yeah, of all places. Chakrabarty is studying pancreatic cancer, and he drops this observation about how cancer cells operate. To protect themselves from the human immune system, cancer cells produce hydrogen peroxide.
It creates like an oxidative shield.
Right. But the insight wasn't just what they produced, it was how. They use specific enzymes to manufacture hydrogen peroxide with an efficiency that is just staggering.
Meanwhile, his friend Sean Hunt is working on the industrial production of hydrogen peroxide, which is a notoriously nasty, massive-scale operation.
Right, because Hunt was dealing with, what's it called in the sources? The anthraquinone process.
The anthraquinone process, yes. And to understand why Chakrabarty's observation was so disruptive, we really have to look at the sheer violence of that traditional industrial method.
Violence is a good word for it.
It is. The process relies on fossil fuel derivatives, heavy metal catalysts, and just massive amounts of thermal energy.
You're taking stable molecules and literally tearing the carbon bonds apart using extreme heat and high pressure.
And then forcing them to recombine.
I'm looking at the numbers from the sources, and even with massive refineries and like decades of optimization, The efficiency of that traditional process hovers around 60%.
Which is terrible. I mean, when a chemical engineer says a process is 60% efficient, it means 40% of the energy and raw material you feed into that billion-dollar facility is just lost.
Poof, gone.
Lost as waste heat radiating into the atmosphere. Lost as hazardous byproducts and toxic sludge that you then have to actually pay to dispose of safely.
It's an incredibly leaky, inefficient way to arrange molecules.
It is.
And Chakrabarty essentially looks at Hunt's massive, energy-intensive problem and says cancer had already figured this out.
Right. The biology of a tumor has evolved to create that exact same chemical, but it has to do it inside a human body.
Yeah, it can't use 1,000 degrees of heat. That would, boil the surrounding tissue and destroy the host.
Exactly. It has to operate efficiently at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit.
So how does it do it?
Biology relies on enzymes, which are nature's catalysts. An enzyme is a complex protein folded into a very specific three-dimensional shape.
Like a puzzle piece.
Yeah, that shape acts like a lock and key for a specific molecule, instead of using raw thermal energy to just smash molecules together until they react.
The brute force method.
Right. The enzyme gently grabs the target molecule, bends it slightly to lower the activation energy required, and allows the chemical bond to break or form at room temperature.
Wow. The precision is just molecular.
It is.
So Solugen's core thesis becomes, what if we stop using extreme heat and dead dinosaurs to make the materials of modern civilization and start using the room temperature precision of enzymes?
And that leads to the creation of what they call the bioforge.
Right. The sources describe their core technology as a chemienzymatic process. It's a hybrid approach, right?
Yes. They take engineered enzymes, like the kind Chakrabarty studied, and combine them with the metal catalysts from Hunt's engineering background.
But the feedstock isn't petroleum.
No, they feed the system dextrose, which is just corn sugar.
They are essentially feeding sugar water to custom-designed proteins.
That's a great way to put it. The enzymes do the heavy lifting of the initial chemical oxidation. They break the initial bonds under incredibly mild conditions.
Like normal atmospheric pressure and room temperature.
Exactly. And once the biological component has prepped the intermediate molecule, the engineered metal catalysts step in to efficiently refine it into the final industrial chemical.
The performance metrics here are what really catch the eye in the deep dive sources. I mean, they point to a near one-to-one yield.
Which is unheard of.
Right. You put 1 ton of dextrose in, you get 1 ton of chemical product out. That completely bypasses that 60% efficiency ceiling of the petrochemical industry.
Plus, because you aren't blasting the mixture with heat or toxic solvents, the reaction has immense selectivity.
Meaning you aren't accidentally creating a cocktail of hazardous byproducts.
Exactly. The environmental accounting is completely inverted. The process boasts zero wastewater discharge and a carbon-negative profile for certain molecules.
Carbon negative. Let's underline that. The carbon atom in the final chemical was originally pulled out of the atmosphere by a stalk of corn.
Right, during photosynthesis.
And by locking that carbon into an organic acid rather than burning it, you are actively sequestering greenhouse gases into physical materials.
It's brilliant. But proving that in a test tube is one thing. Scaling it to compete with a $6 trillion global industry, that is where the physics get punishing.
Oh, absolutely. The roadmap shows they started with a makeshift lab reactor, just making small batches of hydrogen peroxide for niche buyers, like float spas.
Right.
Then they built Bioforge Houston. This was a 10,000 metric ton capacity demonstration plant. And the poetic detail here is that they built this green manufacturing facility directly on the site of a former traditional chemical plant that had literally exploded.
A very literal representation of replacing a volatile, hazardous industry with a stable biological one.
Seriously. But Houston and their smaller Texas facility in Slayton were fundamentally just proving grounds, to show investors the chemistry worked at scale.
Right. The true inflection point is their current project in Marshall, Minnesota.
Bioforge Marshall is massive. They partnered with ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, one of the largest agricultural processors on the planet. The facility is 500,000 square feet, operating 3 modular production trains. The capacity target is 120 kilotons per annum.
That is huge.
That means converting roughly 150 million pounds of dextrose into low-carbon organic acids every single year.
And by co-locating the Bioforge directly next to ADM's massive corn processing complex, Solugen completely eliminates the logistics and transportation emissions of moving their feedstock.
Oh, right. The sugar pipeline goes straight from the agricultural processor directly into the bioforge reactors.
Yep, and the organic acids they produce there are foundational. I mean, they are the base ingredients for water treatment facilities, agricultural products, construction materials, personal care items.
Stuff that makes the modern world run.
Yeah.
And the financial sector is clearly treating this as a massive deal. I mean, they've raised over $850 million,
Wow.
hitting a valuation of roughly $2 billion, backed by heavyweights like Bailey Gifford and Founders Fund. But the ultimate validation, I think, is the $213.6 million conditional loan guarantee from the U.S. Department of Energy.
Yeah, the DOE's involvement there signals a fundamental shift in national industrial policy.
How so?
Well, decarbonizing heavy industry isn't viewed as just a niche environmental vanity project anymore. It's treated as a matter of supply chain resilience.
Ah, I see.
The government wants to prove that the United States can manufacture foundational materials domestically without relying on the volatility of global petrochemical markets.
Okay, let me pause and throw a flag on the play here.
Go for it.
I have to push back on the fundamental premise of this scaling operation. I look at this process and I see a sophisticated brewery.
A brewery.
Yeah. Brewing beer is biological, it's localized, and it happens at room temperature. Refining oil is violent, massive, and centralized.
Okay, I follow.
If Solugen is fundamentally just using custom enzymes and sugar water in large vats, why is this so hard to scale? I mean, if biology is doing the work at room temperature, where is the friction? Why can't we just stamp out 1,000 of these bioforges tomorrow?
What's fascinating here is that this is where the physics of liquids become the ultimate bottleneck.
The physics of liquids.
Yeah. Biology is miraculously efficient at the micro level, but industrial manufacturing is about moving staggering volumes of mass. You mentioned brewing beer.
Right.
The fermentation part of brewing, the biological part, is indeed elegant. But Solugen doesn't want the water. They want the pure chemical product. So the better analogy is actually distilling alcohol.
Oh. Okay, so the biology happens, and then you are left with your valuable organic acids swimming in an ocean of water.
Exactly. And you have to separate them. The downstream processing in a bioforge relies heavily on evaporation and crystallization.
Which takes heat.
A lot of it. Think about the latent heat of vaporization. Water molecules hold on to each other with incredibly strong hydrogen bonds.
Right.
To break those bonds and turn liquid water into steam requires 2,260 kilojoules of energy per kilogram. It is one of the most energy-intensive common physical processes on Earth.
Wow. So even though the enzymatic reaction saves you from building a 1,000-degree furnace to boil away millions of gallons of water, you still need gigawatts of constant, reliable thermal energy.
That is the invisible wall they hit.
Ah.
The per-unit energy intensity might be lower than cracking petroleum, but the absolute volume of production means scaling up to hundreds of bioforges requires massive grid capacity.
And if you want your final product to be truly carbon negative, you can't just plug your evaporators into a coal-fired power plant.
Right. You need vast amounts of cheap, clean electricity.
Okay, so the chemistry works, but the thermodynamics of boiling water cap the entire global ambition.
Yeah.
Energy is the ultimate constraint.
Exactly.
But according to the sources, there is a second massive vulnerability in this roadmap that actually has nothing to do with physics.
Right, the marketing blind spot.
Yeah. Deep tech founders frequently fall into a predictable psychological trap.
They do. They are brilliant engineers who inherently believe that a superior process will automatically conquer the market.
We built a better mousetrap, so the world will beat a path to our door.
Precisely. They assume that if they can prove their chemical yield curve is better and their environmental profile is cleaner, the legacy supply chain will simply adopt it out of sheer rationality.
But the sources explicitly identify this as a critical vulnerability. Solugen produces a product line called Altive.
Yes.
These are bio-based detergent builders. High-performing, non-toxic, carbon-negative ingredients meant for commercial alkaline detergents, dish soap and laundry detergent.
And the strategic analysis in the text argues that Solugen is vastly underestimating the sluggishness of B2B procurement.
Sluggish is an understatement, probably.
Yeah. If you go to a massive legacy consumer packaged goods company and ask them to formulate their flagship dish soap with a new biologically derived ingredient, you are asking them to take a huge risk.
They will test it for years.
Years. They'll try to negotiate the margins down to a fraction of a penny and phase it in over a decade. Legacy supply chains do not move at the speed of startup ambition.
The text makes a fascinating comparison, calling Solugen the Tesla of chemicals that no one has heard of.
I love that analogy.
Let's unpack that. Tesla didn't just invent a highly efficient lithium-ion battery architecture. If they had just been an engineering firm selling batteries to Ford or GM, they would just be an obscure supplier.
Right, they built a sports car.
Exactly. They sold a vision of the future. They made the electric vehicle an aspirational lifestyle choice.
They created a cultural phenomenon that pulled demand through the entire automotive industry. And the argument here is that Solugen needs to do the exact same thing in the chemical sector.
So the sources strongly advocate for a $2 million direct-to-consumer marketing budget to launch a breakout household detergent.
Yes.
But wait, so the idea isn't to become a soap company permanently, it is a tactical strike.
Exactly.
Imagine walking down the aisle and seeing a laundry detergent that cleans perfectly, is entirely non-toxic, and literally sequesters carbon from the atmosphere.
It's an incredible pitch.
But if they make that product go viral, if they create that cultural cachet, what does that actually accomplish for a company that wants to build multi-billion-dollar industrial factories? Why should a deep-tech chemical manufacturer care about selling soap directly to you and me?
Because it creates inescapable pull-through demand. You change the dynamic entirely.
How so?
Instead of pushing an ingredient onto a reluctant procurement manager, you have the consumer demand the product from the retailer.
Oh, I see.
If millions of consumers suddenly demand carbon-negative dish soap, Target and Whole Foods demand it from the legacy brands.
And those legacy brands are forced to immediately source the active ingredients from Solugen.
Exactly. The marketing budget is essentially a structural lever to de-risk the massive capital expenditure of building a bioforge.
You don't build a 500,000 square foot factory hoping the legacy brands will eventually buy the output.
No, you manufacture the consumer demand first, which guarantees the factory's output is sold before the concrete is even poured.
As the text notes, marketing isn't just advertising, it's propulsion. It justifies the infrastructure.
It does.
Which brings us to a really fascinating collision. Let's assume Solugen executes this flawlessly. The consumer brand goes viral, the legacy supply chain capitulates, and suddenly Solugen needs to build dozens of massive bioforges all over the globe to meet this skyrocketing demand.
They're going to slam face first into that energy wall.
Exactly. They will need gigawatts of clean power just to run the evaporators. So where on earth do you find that kind of untapped, stranded green energy?
Well, according to the second startup roadmap in our stack, you don't look on the grid.
No.
You look at the Himalayas.
This is where the sheer scale of ambition in these documents becomes staggering. If Solugen is trying to be the Tesla of manufacturing, Himalayan Compute is explicitly positioning itself as the SpaceX of data centers.
Which is quite the title.
They are pitching a planetary infrastructure roadmap aimed at a $1 trillion valuation within a decade.
$1 trillion in 10 years. That requires a growth curve that defies standard economics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's look at their core differentiator. They are not trying to build in Silicon Valley or Northern Virginia. The entire thesis begins with the geography of Nepal.
Right. Nepal offers a unique convergence of hydrology and climate. You have massive, fast-flowing river systems dropping from the highest elevations on the planet.
The kinetic energy generated by water rushing down from the Himalayas provides incredible, continuous baseload hydropower.
And the roadmap cites energy costs of roughly 3.5 to 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour.
Which is absurdly cheap compared to industrial power rates in the US or Europe, which can easily be 3 to 5 times higher.
Yeah. But it is not just the cost of spinning the turbines, it is the thermal environment.
Right, cooling.
We have to consider the thermodynamics of modern artificial intelligence. High-density GPU clusters, the hardware used to train massive AI models, they generate immense amounts of heat.
Like a single rack of H100 chips is effectively an industrial space heater that happens to do complex math.
Exactly. In a standard data center, you spend almost as much energy running massive chiller plants to keep the servers from melting as you do running the computations.
And the sources highlight a projected power usage effectiveness, or PUE, of 1.2 to 1.3 for these Himalayan facilities.
Which is fantastic.
Yeah, for context for anyone listening, PUE is a ratio. Total facility power divided by the power actually used by the computing equipment.
Right.
So a perfect, theoretically impossible facility where every single watt goes into the microchips and nothing is wasted on lights or cooling would have a PUE of 1.0.
And the global average is often around 1.5.
Right, so hitting 1.2 in a high-density AI environment is a massive operational advantage.
And they can do that because the air at that altitude is naturally frigid year-round. You largely bypass the need for energy-intensive mechanical chillers. You can pull the ambient mountain air directly through the server racks.
Free cooling.
Yeah.
But beyond the physics, the roadmap leans heavily into global geopolitics. They framed Nepal as a compute Switzerland. Now, to be clear, looking at the source text, this isn't about taking a moral or political stance on global trade wars. This is purely about how infrastructure startups are mathematically de-risking their billion-dollar supply chains.
Exactly. We are operating in an era of intense digital sovereignty.
The United States and China are in a profound technology competition.
And regions like India and Europe are increasingly protective of where their citizens' data resides and where their proprietary AI models are trained.
Nepal is geographically wedged right between India and China, yet it maintains a non-aligned diplomatic posture.
It is a neutral zone. Himalayan Compute is betting that American, Indian, European, and potentially Chinese hyperscalers will need a safe, neutral territory to lease massive compute capacity.
Without triggering the national security friction they'd face building in each other's backyards.
It is a strategic wedge.
Let's look at how they plan to finance this. The early phase years 0 to 5 is the ignition and ramp. They're targeting a $50 to $150 million seed or Series A round.
Interestingly, a significant portion of this is aimed at the successful Nepali diaspora globally.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah. They plan a dual headquarters structure, San Francisco to access the elite venture capital and hardware networks, and Kathmandu to manage the physical infrastructure and local government relations.
The pilot campus aims for a 20 to 50 megawatt IT load. And, just a few years ago, 50 megawatts was considered a flagship data center.
In the AI era, that is merely a pilot project.
Wild. They project scaling rapidly to over 200 megawatts in Nepal and then expanding into the India-Himalayan states, the Indo-Himalayan Bridge, targeting an astonishing 500 megawatts to 1 gigawatt of capacity.
That's a massive leap.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I have to stop and do the math here. We're talking about going from a $50 million seed round to a $1 trillion valuation in 10 years.
Right.
That means multiplying their value by 20,000 times. That requires a market dynamic that simply doesn't exist in normal industries. Is this fundamentally just a piece of startup science fiction meant to hype up early investors?
The execution risk is practically vertical, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
Permitting delays, supply chain shortages for NVIDIA hardware, or local political instability could derail the entire timeline. However, you have to look at the macro environment they are building into to understand why the valuation isn't entirely disconnected from reality.
Okay, explain that.
We are facing a global grid constraint that is unprecedented. Estimates suggest the world needs to add hundreds of gigawatts of new power capacity by 2035 simply to support the exponential growth of AI training and inference.
And the legacy power grids in the US and Europe are already saturated.
Completely. Utilities are telling tech giants they cannot guarantee new power connections for half a decade or more.
Wow, so the demand for AI infrastructure isn't just growing. It is an absolute tidal wave slamming into a static power grid.
Therefore, in a world where access to massive high-density power is the single greatest bottleneck for the entire global technology sector, a company that successfully captures gigawatts of geopolitically neutral, 100% renewable power will be valued like a monopoly.
Because the scarcity is absolute. The multiples are astronomical.
Exactly.
But the roadmap acknowledges that even the Himalayas have physical limits.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot reach $1 trillion by being confined to one mountain range, no matter how big the rivers are.
No, you can't.
Which brings us to the planetary scale of the vision. To reach the end game, they plan to decouple from terrestrial geography entirely.
Years 6 to 9 detail the terrestrial and blue compute expansion.
Okay, let's break that down.
The Solara terrestrial phase involves overbuilding massive solar farms in sun-drenched, energy-stranded regions, like the deserts of Rajasthan in India, the Middle Eastern Gulf, and the Sahara.
I am stuck on the word overbuilding. Solar only generates power during the day, but an AI data center must run 247 to justify the cost of the chips.
Right, but the economics of photovoltaic panels have dropped so precipitously that it is now financially viable to build vastly more solar capacity than the data center requires during peak sunlight.
Oh, so you use that massive excess generation to charge monumental battery storage banks.
Exactly, which then discharge overnight to keep the servers running. And they plan to connect these desert compute nodes to Europe and the Middle East via ultra-low latency undersea cables.
Okay, that's the terrestrial side. The blue compute layer is where the engineering starts to sound like a Jules Verne novel.
It really does.
They're proposing offshore, floating data centers in the South China Sea.
Floating servers.
Yeah. The architecture uses wave energy converters, harnessing the constant kinetic motion of the ocean swells to generate electricity, and directly utilizing the infinite heat sink of the deep ocean to cool the server racks.
It theoretically solves the two hardest problems in Asian markets: real estate and thermal management.
Because land in densely populated coastal regions is prohibitively expensive, and ambient cooling doesn't work in tropical humidity.
Right, so the ocean offers free real estate and free cooling.
But the massive engineering hurdle, of course, is protecting highly sensitive, multi-million-dollar microprocessors from the corrosive effects of salt water, extreme humidity, and typhoons.
Which is a monumental engineering risk.
Just a bit.
But remarkably, floating ocean servers are only the prelude. Year 10 of the roadmap outlines the orbital vision.
This is the ultimate sci-fi element. They want to put AI data centers into space.
Yes. This entire phase is predicated on the maturation of next-generation aerospace capabilities. Specifically, the massive reduction in launch costs driven by reusable heavy-lift rockets.
The roadmap explicitly targets Starship-class economics, assuming the cost to push mass into low Earth orbit drops below $100 to $200 per kilogram.
Right.
But why space? If you are an AI company, why go through the immense difficulty of launching servers on a rocket?
Because orbit offers the ultimate unconstrained energy environment.
Unconstrained?
Yeah. If you place a satellite in a specific sun-synchronous orbit, its solar panels are bathed in constant, unfiltered solar radiation 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Wow. There's no atmospheric interference, no clouds, and no night shift to plan for. But wait. Space is a vacuum. We just talked about the nightmare of cooling GPU racks using ocean water or freezing mountain air. How do you cool a supercomputer when there's no air or water to carry the heat away?
That is the defining engineering challenge of orbital compute. Space is cold, but it is empty. Convection doesn't work.
Right.
You cannot use a fan to blow hot air away from a chip because there is no air. You have to rely entirely on radiation.
So the heat must be transferred to massive radiator panels that emit the thermal energy as infrared radiation into the deep chill of space.
Exactly. Furthermore, standard silicon chips degrade rapidly when exposed to cosmic rays outside the protection of Earth's atmosphere.
So the hardware must be heavily radiation hardened.
It has to be.
The roadmap proposes a hybrid architecture to manage this, right? You use the Earth-based infrastructure, the massive Himalayan hydro facilities, and the desert solar farms to perform the extremely data-heavy task of training the foundational AI models.
Right, because training takes massive data pipelines.
But then you launch the trained models into orbit for inference.
Yeah.
And inference is when the AI is actually answering user queries, processing voice commands, and doing the daily work. They would use laser intersatellite links to beam this processed data directly back down to Earth.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, orbital compute represents the ultimate end run around local terrestrial politics and physical grid constraints.
Imagine looking up at the night sky, knowing there are server racks glowing with solar power in low Earth orbit, processing the query you just typed into your phone. It is a staggering visual.
It really is.
But why is this the logical endgame?
Like I said, you don't have to spend 5 years begging a local utility to upgrade a transmission line. You don't need zoning permits from a city council to build a solar array in space.
For the hyperscale technology giants, orbit offers true infinite scalability.
It does.
So we have these two massive parallel visions. Solugen, the brilliant chemical manufacturer facing an impending energy wall as it tries to scale its bioforges, and Himalayan Compute, the planetary infrastructure moonshot that possesses the blueprint for the exact green energy Solugen desperately needs, but requires early capital and deep tech validation to get off the ground.
Right.
How do these two blueprints intersect? To understand the strategic proposal and the sources, we have to look backward. We need to dissect the 2005 business deal between Yahoo and Alibaba.
It remains one of the most asymmetric, consequential corporate investments in internet history, and it provides the exact template for how physical and digital infrastructure companies must collaborate today.
Let's set the stage. The year is 2005. Yahoo, under the leadership of co-founder Jerry Yang, is a global powerhouse. but they're terrified of Google's rise.
Yeah.
They have been trying to conquer the exploding Chinese internet market directly through their subsidiary, Yahoo China.
Yeah.
But they are failing.
The regulatory environment is opaque, local competitors are outmaneuvering them, and they are bleeding cash in a market they fundamentally do not understand.
Simultaneously, you have an obscure Chinese e-commerce startup called Alibaba, run by an English teacher named Jack Ma.
Alibaba is locked in a brutal existential war with eBay for dominance over the Chinese consumer market.
And they desperately need a massive influx of capital to survive.
So Jerry Yang realizes that Yahoo cannot win a ground war in China, and he makes a highly unconventional, incredibly aggressive strategic pivot.
He effectively outsources Yahoo's entire Chinese strategy to Jack Ma.
Exactly. Yahoo hands over $1 billion in cash, plus the entire operating assets of Yahoo China, in exchange for a 40% equity stake in Alibaba.
$1 billion for a minority stake in an unprofitable startup in 2005 was viewed by many as sheer lunacy.
It was a monumental risk, but the underlying logic was sound.
How so?
Alibaba used the billion-dollar war chest to completely overwhelm eBay, build out their logistics network, and eventually expand into cloud computing.
And Yahoo secured a massive claim on the future growth of the Chinese digital economy without having to navigate the operational nightmare of building it themselves.
But the sources are careful to point out that this was not a passive, easy relationship. Minority investments across borders are inherently volatile.
Right. The text details the massive friction that erupted in 2011 over Alipay.
Yes. Alipay was Alibaba's proprietary payment processor, essentially the PayPal of China, and arguably the most valuable piece of the entire ecosystem.
And Jack Ma unilaterally spun Alipay out of Alibaba into a separate entity that he personally controlled.
Yahoo and another major investor, SoftBank, were blindsided. They publicly claimed this asset stripping happened without board approval.
Jack Ma's defense was that new Chinese financial regulations strictly limited foreign ownership of payment processors, and spinning it out was the only way to retain the necessary operating licenses.
Regardless of who was right, it caused Yahoo's stock to plummet.
And it exposed the glaring vulnerability of the strategy. When you buy a minority stake, you lack operational control.
Right. You are at the mercy of different corporate governance standards and opaque geopolitical regulations.
But despite the public corporate warfare, you have to look at the ultimate financial outcome. They eventually reached a settlement, and the windfall was historic.
Very historic.
In 2012, Alibaba repurchased half of Yahoo's stake for $7.1 billion in cash. That is a 7x return just on the first tranche.
Wow.
Then in 2014, Alibaba went public on the New York Stock Exchange in what was then the largest initial public offering in history, reaching a valuation north of $200 billion.
Financial analysts calculate that Yahoo's initial $1 billion bet generated a return exceeding 3,500%.
3,500%. The value of their remaining stake fluctuated between $35 and $80 billion.
The brutal irony is that Yahoo's core search and portal business was completely crushed by Google and Facebook.
But the company itself survived as a massive, lucrative investment vehicle, eventually rebranding as Alibaba purely because of that single 2005 strategic bet.
The takeaway isn't about e-commerce. It is about the mechanics of asymmetric upside.
A highly targeted strategic investment acts as a call option on a future paradigm that you cannot build yourself, but that you absolutely need to survive.
And that brings us to the masterstroke pitched in our sources.
Right. The strategic proposal is that Solugen, the biomanufacturing company, should invest $1 to $2 million into Himalayan Compute's current $5 million seed raise.
That investment values the compute startup at a highly speculative $50 million.
Let's break down the mutual mechanics of this. Solugen is hurtling toward an energy bottleneck. By taking an early equity stake, they secure preferential priority access to incredibly cheap 100% renewable compute power.
They need that heavy computational muscle to run the generative AI models that design their complex mutated enzymes.
Furthermore, Himalayan Compute is actively mapping out the future geography of energy abundance.
They are targeting regions like Kolkata and West Bengal, which sit at the base of the Himalayan hydropower network.
And Solugen gets an inside track on these precise locations, allowing them to site their future multi-gigawatt bioforges exactly where green power will be plentiful and cheap.
On the other side of the ledger, Himalayan Compute gets a crucial injection of early capital from a validated, highly respected deep tech player.
Which signals to the broader venture capital market that their roadmap is credible.
Exactly.
But I have to jump in here and play devil's advocate. I struggle with the core focus of this. Solugen is fundamentally a chemical engineering company. They make ingredients for dish soap and concrete. Do they really have any business acting like a Silicon Valley venture capital firm?
This raises an important question.
Isn't this exactly how promising startups lose their edge? You take your eye off the reactor yields and start playing financier in a domain you don't fully understand.
That is a critical distinction to make. In traditional corporate strategy, M&A mergers and acquisitions are often about absorbing a competitor or buying a new product line to integrate into your core operations.
Right, which can be a huge distraction.
That can absolutely cause terminal distraction. But a minority strategic investment of this nature is a completely different mechanism.
Okay, how so?
This isn't an attempt to diversify their business model, and it isn't charity. It is a relatively cheap hedge against their own existential vulnerabilities.
Solugen realizes that in the 2030s, the two most scarce and valuable resources on the planet will be green energy and massive computational power.
Exactly. If Himalayan Compute's audacious plan fails, Solugen writes off a $1 or $2 million loss. In the context of the $850 million they have raised, that is a rounding error.
But if Himalayan Compute succeeds in capturing gigawatts of the cheapest green power on Earth,
Solugen isn't standing at the back of the line begging a utility for grid access. They are a preferred partner.
they get to build their infrastructure adjacent to the power source, completely bypassing the grid constraints that will suffocate their legacy petrochemical competitors.
In software, you buy companies to acquire their code. In deep tech, you buy minority stakes in infrastructure to guarantee your own physical survival.
You are buying a VIP pass to the exact environment you are going to need a decade from now, just like Jerry Yang bought a VIP pass to the Chinese internet. It is an incredibly sophisticated defensive strategy.
It is.
We have charted a massive trajectory today. We started by examining how the microscopic biological efficiencies hidden inside a pancreatic cancer cell inspired an entirely new paradigm for manufacturing the physical world.
We traced that chemistry from a poker table insight to multi-gigawatt biomanufacturing plants in Texas and Minnesota.
We unpack the punishing physics of the latent heat of vaporization, exposing the massive thermal energy required just to boil water, the invisible wall that threatens to cap the bioeconomy.
We examine the psychology of deep tech founders and how a $2 million marketing budget to create a viral, carbon-negative consumer product can mathematically de-risk the construction of billion-dollar factories.
Then we look to the Himalayas, breaking down a roadmap to harness the kinetic energy of mountain rivers, overbuild solar in the Sahara, and deploy wave converters in the South China Sea to feed the insatiable thermal demands of artificial intelligence.
We pushed into the vacuum of low Earth orbit to understand how Starship economics and radiation cooling could allow us to bypass the terrestrial power grid entirely.
And finally, we connected the thermodynamics of the future with the corporate history of the past, demonstrating how a small strategic investment today can act as a call option on a company's physical survival tomorrow.
The single thread pulling all of this together is the brutal, inescapable reality of energy and scale.
The next era of technological progress will not be purely digital. It has to be physically built, and it has to be massively powered.
The organizations that understand the deep intersection of biological efficiency, orbital infrastructure, and global energy dynamics are the ones drafting the actual blueprints for the remainder of this century.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over. It is a seemingly throwaway quote from the source text that completely reframes the scale of what we've discussed. Gaurav Chakrabarty, the CEO of Solugen, casually mentioned the long-term concept of building a bioforge on Mars.
Wow.
Think about the sheer physics of that. We just detailed Himalayan Compute's vision for orbital AI nodes and space-based solar power designed to bypass Earth's congested grid. If those orbital infrastructure nodes are successfully deployed, could that exact same architecture eventually power the first off-world zero-gravity biological manufacturing plants?
That is wild.
Could we use engineered enzymes and continuous space-based solar radiation to manufacture the complex chemicals, fuels, and materials required to sustain human life in deep space, completely bypassing the biological limits of Earth's fragile ecosystem altogether?
It sounds like pure science fiction.
It does. But as we've seen today, yesterday's science fiction is rapidly becoming tomorrow's infrastructure plan. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you a new lens on the invisible forces of energy and biology shaping our world. Keep questioning the blueprints of tomorrow, and we will see you next time.